Well, hello there. So excited that you guys are here to join us for another week. This week is a little bit different from some of our past weeks. We've just wrapped up our This Is It series, that 3-week series. We're about to head into a 10-week study of the book of Ephesians. But this week we're kind of pressing pause a little bit, and all 4 campuses hearing the same sermon. And really, this week revolves around one question, and that's it. And the question is, does God care? Does God care? And so I thought, Randy, we could talk about that a little bit today before we dive into too much of trying to answer that question. Do you think it's okay to ask that question of God?
Of God? I certainly hope so. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can look at Old Testament or New Testament without getting the sense of many, many people have asked the question in different ways. God, where are you? Do you care about me? Are you aware of what's going on in my life? And I think immediately what comes to mind, and this may seem a little cliche, but it's just Job and his story. He had a lot of questions for God. Now God responded, kind of with okay, well, it's fair to ask me these questions, but I want you to buckle up because I'm going to answer these questions. But I think ultimately what he communicated through that story and countless others, whether it was when Paul was imprisoned or whatever else, is just this idea of I'm always working on your behalf and ultimately for your good and for my glory. It may not feel like it's for your good in the present, but even if the struggle or the answer to do I care, if it doesn't seem fully answered even before you die, that you have to trust that I'm putting something together that's going to outlive you and point people to me. So yeah, I think that's a really long, convoluted answer. But yeah, I think God is not only comfortable with it, I think He likes it.
Yeah, I think so too. I think He likes just authentic faith. And I think one of the things that I love about our church, about Sea Life, kind of the culture that you 3 co-pastors have set, is that you have made it a safe place to ask the real questions in life. Because the truth is, if it's not okay to ask God, that doesn't mean that people are going to all of a sudden stop asking it.
Right.
That's a real life question that I think most people probably bump into at some point or another. And just to communicate that God is big enough to handle whatever questions you have. It's not like you're going to bring a question to God and He's going to be like, I'm so offended and how dare you bring that before. I think God wants to have a real conversation about it. And if it's a question that you're struggling with, He wants the opportunity to speak into it. But the problem is that a lot of times, I guess churches feel like they're an unsafe place, or religious people of faith feel like they are an unsafe place to ask those questions. And so what happens is people feel like they can't ask those questions, and so they kind of check out from church, check out from faith, because it's not a safe place to deal with the things that they're really struggling with. And so I think it's important for you to get inside your mind. If you've had that question, that's okay. And hopefully the sermon and this discussion is helpful to you. So have you ever wondered that? Does God care?
Oh yeah.
In your life?
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember one time in particular, whenever I was living in Oklahoma with my dad and stepmom, and there had been a real volatile kind of thing happen in our home, and so I was sleeping outside. It just seemed safer, and not because I was worried about necessarily being in physical danger, it just emotionally felt a lot safer. And so I remember laying outside and just thinking, if you are really God and you really do care, like, why is this happening this way? And what have I done to deserve this? Or why can my family not be whole? Why, and I think all of those questions, I pose them in a lot of different ways, but at the end of the day, I think I was a kid asking God, do you care about me? Do you care about the situation that's going on here? And what's been really cool is to see over time how God has answered that question, that yes, He not only cared about me in the middle of that struggle, but he cared about my dad at that point. He cared about my stepmom at that point. He cared about everything that was broken in our family. And so now that I get past it and I'm able to look back, I'm able to see that what, He really did care. And even that night, whenever I was, and those nights, I should say, because it happened more than once, God was present in those moments. And even as a kid, and I didn't know really how to feel that, I was so, I guess, trusting that He was there, and if He was there, that He did care, just by asking the question. So I don't know. Yeah, I've asked the question multiple times. Whenever we had a miscarriage, I asked the question. Whenever we were facing what I would call modern day persecution for starting Sea Life, I remember asking those kinds of questions. Whenever I was battling anxiety, again, multiple times, I remember asking the question of, where are you?
Yeah. Yep.
You know, because this part of my life sucks really bad right now. And if you cared, I know you got the power to fix it. Why don't you just fix it?
Yeah, totally. So,
I think he's good with it. I think
thanks for opening it up and sharing those things. I know some of those things are pretty personal. I'd encourage you in your group right now, why don't you take a turn, follow in Randy's footsteps there. Have you guys ever struggled with that question? Have you ever asked that question? Maybe you've never let anybody in on that you're asking that question, but would have been some times in your life where you have asked the question, God, do you even care about this, what I'm going through? I think there's some common times when people kind of confront that question and that thought, and that's kind of what we discussed in the sermon a little bit, at least two of the times when people struggle with that. I think oftentimes one of the times we question whether or not God cares is when what we're dealing with, what we're going through, feels too insignificant to even make a blip on his radar screen. We talked about that with Jesus' very first miracle in John chapter 2, whenever he turned the water into the wine at the wedding at Cana. And Jesus' first response, whenever his mom put the request on him, hey, can you do something, Jesus, about them running out of wine? Jesus' response was, woman, what does this have to do with me? And I think sometimes we kind of have that thought that we've got some stuff that is really stressing us out, things that we're really concerned about, but because we don't really know if it's inherently spiritual or if we don't know if it's a big enough deal, that God may not even really care about it. And that kind of is an intimidating thing if you think you're going to bring something to Jesus and he's like, yeah, that honestly doesn't even have anything to do with me. You know, you want to speak into that at all? I mean, do you think people kind of struggle with that idea that what they're going through isn't even registering with Jesus?
Yeah, I think so, and partially because everything's so visible just in our culture, whether it's on Facebook or whatever else, that I think we minimize a lot of our own problems because it doesn't seem as grand or sensationalized as the person that we just read their last post or whatever. And so there's a whole lot of the world that's communicating to us, your problem's not as big as mine, your issue is not as dramatic as mine, your home is not as broken as mine, or whatever else. And so I think we begin to internalize that and go, you know what, I just need to suck it up and I need to push through. And what's really interesting is the scripture tells us, but if it's a burden to you, then cast it on him. And you mentioned that in your sermon, which I thought was awesome. If it's something that you care about, that you don't have to carry that burden, you can cast that burden. You said it much more eloquently, but it was good. It was really good. And so it doesn't really matter what all the people on Facebook think about it. And honestly, people quit posting stuff like that on Facebook, but it doesn't really matter what everybody else thinks about it. If it's a burden on your heart, then it matters to God. And one thing, I'd read this a long time ago. I don't even remember who wrote it. I would like to give them credit, but they were talking about the wedding ceremony back in Jesus' day, and just you had mentioned how it can be a week long or longer or whatever, but there was legal responsibility on the part of the host. And so whenever I've read this story in the past, and I use it at weddings a lot, I think not only was it Jesus' first miracle, but it was redemptive. Like it was a big deal that he did that, because he provided grace to this guy that ran out of wine whenever that guy could have been held not only by his peers, but he could have been held legally liable. And so what seems insignificant to us or whatever else, there's always, I think, more riding on it, and I think God's aware of that. And so I think he's not only aware, but he cares about it.
Awesome. That's great.
It's a grace move.
Don't have anything to add to that. Yeah. That's awesome. And then we also looked at another story, another encounter with Jesus in John chapter 11, where one of Jesus' good friends, Lazarus, has fallen ill. Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, who are also good friends of Jesus, they send word to Jesus, hey, Jesus, the one whom you love is ill. The implication, come quick. We need you to heal our brother. And it says that Jesus stayed in the town where he was for 2 extra days. Didn't show up when Mary and Martha called on him and needed him. Jesus didn't show up. And I think this kind of leads us to one of the other really common times that we question whether or not God cares about us is that whenever we call on Jesus and we find ourselves in a desperate situation and we're doing all the things that we've been told to do, trying to stay faithful, and yet Jesus just doesn't show up, and our situation goes from bad to worse. And it can be really difficult because we kind of feel like, what is God to us if he is not there for us in the hard times when we need him the most? And so, man, I know I've personally talked to people who that question in those difficult times has really pushed them away from faith. I remember talking back when I was a youth pastor. I remember talking to this one young man who he let me know that he walked away from the faith whenever one of his grandparents passed away, and he had prayed to God for their healing, and God didn't heal him. And so he kind of walked away from the faith at that point because he just had this irreconcilable thought that, man, God, if you really care about me and us and your people and you are all powerful, well, then you should have done something there. I think that's probably a question that is more common than we realize, that more people have felt that. I've felt that at times in my life where I've prayed prayers for years to see God's movement in areas that I know he has the power to move in, and he hasn't done it, and the situation has gone from bad to worse. And I think we can come to the conclusion sometimes that, well, the reason why God's not doing anything is because he just doesn't care, because he just doesn't care. And that's the connection, and really the driving home point and the central verse that you already mentioned a little bit, 1 Peter 5:7, that verse has been so powerful for me. It says, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. You see, there's a connection between the care of God and my anxiety levels. Because if I believe that he cares and I know he cares, that lets me know I can cast it on him. I don't have to carry it all myself. Yeah. But whenever I begin to doubt if he cares about me, which I think that's one of the enemy's foremost tools he uses against us, he just wants to make us think that God doesn't care. Because if God doesn't care, then I've got to carry it all. And then I live a very burdened life. Yeah. And so I just think that's really kind of the message here that we want to drive home to people is cast it all on him because he cares for you. All your anxiety, everything, big, small, everything, cast it on. He may not be showing up just yet, but he cares about it. And so keep bringing it to him. So maybe we conclude this time here. We're about to turn you loose to your groups, but what are some of the things that you've found yourself carrying? Maybe because you've doubted if God really cares about you. What are some of the things that you've been carrying? And maybe what would it take for you to feel like you could really cast that on him and to let him carry that for you? So, you got anything else to add, Rainey?
And I just don't give up on God. And I think we said this in a sermon, don't give up on a God who hasn't given up on you. Because Jesus could have called down angels to take him off the cross, but he didn't. He walked through that suffering on our behalf. There have been a number of things where I questioned, God, do you care about this? Do you care about that? And one of the clearest ones was I'd been praying for my dad for a long time, and that he would come to faith. And honestly, had kind of given up on praying that prayer because I was like, I don't think he's too far gone, but maybe he and God have something that, it's just not going to happen. And I will never forget the number of times I prayed for his salvation. I will never forget kind of giving up on the idea that he was ever going to be saved. And I will never forget when he called me to tell me that he had been saved. Awesome. And there was a lot of stuff that was happening up here that in hindsight, I can now see God was actually at work in those moments. I couldn't see it then. And so one thing that I've just continued to learn, and I would reinforce this with everybody in your groups, you don't get the privilege of hindsight until you have walked through those difficult moments. So it's not that God doesn't care. It's that God may be doing something that is far bigger, far holier, far more dynamic than could have been accomplished in that moment when you first prayed it. And whenever you get the hindsight, you get to see that he not only cared at that moment, but he cared enough to do something about it. And so we just have to be patient, I think. And that's why we cast it. We can't carry it. If we carry it, it's going to kill us. But we cast it, and that casting is trusting that at some point God will do with whatever it is, whatever he feels is appropriate. Then you get the benefit of hindsight when you see it happen.
Say that, Randy Wade. Say that. Little mini sermon. That was awesome. We can't improve upon that. So excited that you're gathering together with other people to kind of work through some of these thoughts and questions. Keep it up. We'll turn you loose now. See you back next week.